I'm Linda Nickel, and welcome to another session of my Happiness Hour. My goal here is to help us connect, inspire, and create. We do this every Wednesday night, live here on Zoom, with a new topic and a new speaker. On Tuesdays, I post the list of upcoming presentations to my Instagram page, which is at Cousin Linda, and on my website at lindanickel.com. And you're going to find our previous sessions linked to YouTube from my website. The lady that has kept me busy all week, and I'm not exaggerating because she has another great idea, is Erin Randall, who is currently hanging out in Montana. So say hello, Erin.
I'm going to move to howdy this time.
Your goal here is to make me laugh, and it works. Okay, so our guest this evening is Alyce Bender. And Bender is joining us from Las Vegas tonight. Her images and articles have appeared in Outdoor Photographer, Landscape Photography Magazine, and Wild Planet Photography Magazine, to name just a few well-known and respected publications. As a Tamron Pro Ambassador, Bender represents Tamron USA, which is a leader in the optical lens industry. As an instructor and workshop tour leader, pre-COVID, you would have found Bender all over the globe this year. But like all of us, she's still getting out there with her camera and working on special projects a little closer to home base. In the next 45 minutes, I think she's going to inspire you to stay creative and get outside with your cameras. Bender, welcome to the Happiness Hour community. I am so happy that you agreed to do a presentation, and I'm really excited to see what you've put together for us tonight. So with that, I'm gonna hand it over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so very much, Linda, for having me, for asking me to come on and talk to all these wonderful people from all across the country. I love doing this. This has kind of gotten to be a really great way for me to connect with people during this time where we're all kind of sheltering in place, or, you know, kind of staying closer to home for the most part. Or if we are going out, it's normally by ourselves. So this is a wonderful opportunity. So thank you so much for having me on.
So happy that you could do this.
Yeah. So I guess I'll just start by kind of introducing myself for those who don't know me. As Linda so wonderfully introduced me, I'm Alyce Bender. I go by Bender, and I have been doing photography in some form or fashion since I was about knee-high with a point-and-shoot Kodak film camera, and now I have moved on upwards and now do this full-time. And traditional years, I would be traveling over half the year to various locations both across the country and the world. My specialty is Japan, where I lived for 2.5 years and try to go back to every year I possibly can. I absolutely love Japan. And then so far as my actual photography genre, I say I'm a nature photographer because I do everything from epic landscapes to macro landscapes to macro wildlife and full-size wildlife. So I cover the spectrum when it comes to nature. I also work in creative landscapes and creative nature photography, which we'll see a little bit of in this presentation. But feel free to check out my Instagram, abenderphoto, or my website, abenderphotography.com. And all of that information will be up at the end of the presentation as well. So without further ado, I guess we'll jump right into it. So tonight we will be talking on macro and focusing on the small things that we find pretty much everywhere. So just for anybody who is new to macro photography, basically it is where a photograph, you are photographing a subject that is smaller in life than it is in the image, or a one-to-one. A lot of times it's one-to-one, which means then that the image is life-size. So I guess the artistic side of it is that it is to highlight the beauty we find in the small details around us, whether they be nature or man-made. But macro photography is all about highlighting those minute details that we find throughout our lives. Can be done indoors, outdoors, man-made, nature, in a curated setting or in a natural setting. But for me, I really took to this. I started getting into it a bit when I was just out and about between my normal landscape or wildlife shoots, just to kind of fill time, because I love photography. So I was figuring out what I needed to do to fill my time while I was out in the field, between those, times that you're actively shooting and just kind of out wandering around. And so for me, it's part of the slow photography movement, where basically you go out without a true intent. You're not going out to this one specific spot to shoot this, epic vista at sunset. You're just going out in order to shoot. So macro really fits with that way of photography, because you can just wander out into your front yard and there's so many things you can find just within, a 1 foot or 3 foot space that you might sit down in. So for me, this came about starting when I was out doing scouting locations and that. But then with COVID this year, I took about 6 weeks, and every day I went out just to shoot macro photography, and really got into it, using it as a way to still be active, still creative, and still adhere to health and safety protocols. So this first portion that I'm going to talk about is kind of what to look for, so that when you're first starting out, you can then go in, and when you're out, you have an idea of kind of what you're going to be looking for when starting out with macro. So Brian Peterson is, I consider him, and many do consider him, to be a foremost expert on color theory and photography. He has written so many books about it. If you don't know who Brian Peterson is, I highly suggest looking him up, taking a look. He's an absolutely phenomenal photographer, and his use of color is just stunning. And he says to shoot the adjective. And to me, that really hit home, especially with macro. It's really defining what it is you are trying to capture in an image. Think of what draws you to the scene, what draws you to this small detail that you've come across, whether it's a tiny flower or a bug, or just the lines in grass, whatever it might be. What is it that draws you to that? And so in talking about color and color theory, you can really put that to use in looking for your scenes. So things you want to look for when it comes to color are going to be things like red and green, which are complementary colors, or yellow and green, which are analogous colors, which basically means on the color wheel they sit next to each other versus directly across from each other, which is the complementary colors. And so by understanding the color wheel and how those colors will visually correspond with each other, whether they clash or whether they do complement each other, and whether they will give a visual appeal to someone looking at your image, you can really help bring your images to life by ensuring that your colors are coordinated, if you will. So in this image, we have the reds, green, and yellow, which are complementary colors. This is me playing in my kitchen at the beginning of COVID, with just some olive oil and water in a bowl that I then set over colored paper, and created this image. You can also look at colors when using a single color, like a single color flower, and then looking for the tones and the shading that come with that image, with that composition, and looking to see, you know, okay, what patterns are replicated so that even though you have a single color, you have the pattern to really add interest to your image. And moving further into patterns, you can take color out of it if you have a really strong pattern. So in these images here, you have the dewdrops in a web, and it was kind of in a shadowed area, and I just loved how the light caught in each one of those dewdrops. And so by turning it black and white, you're really able to hone that pattern and really draw the viewer's attention to the pattern that originally caught your eye with the subject that you're shooting. Other patterns in nature that a lot of times make for great macro, and again, it's shooting what catches your eye. So with cactus here in the desert Southwest, you know, it's that spininess, it's that texture that comes with the cactus. And on top of that, they've got some great views and of great hues and different color patterns within them. So trying to capture those adjectives of cactus or of spines. You're not just shooting the spines, shoot for that adjective. And here's another one that was played with it, you know, in my kitchen. This is just shooting, these are little bubbles, air bubbles on top of the water that form this pattern. And again, using that color to make it pop, but then really honing in on that pattern in order to bring interest to the image. So then details. So macro photography, again, like we're looking at the very small pieces of nature that we come across. And so the details, I call this the details of details. So you're not just shooting the flower, you're shooting a part of the flower. So this upper image here with the black background, that is the tongue of an orchid flower. So it's very small. But just looking at just that very small detail of an already very small piece of nature is what you want to highlight and look for when looking for subjects to shoot with macro. Gardens are, if you have a backyard that has flowers and are, you know, you're able to maybe even do just potted plants a lot of times, it's absolutely amazing to see what you can find at a macro level. And so these are just, again, examples of finding those very small details within a small scene. So highlighting the hairs or this one bud of a flower, or the pattern of flowers, but again, just a very small segment of that scene. Or a favorite of mine is water droplets, and I think that's a very popular subject to shoot within macro. So in this is a succulent that I just bought at Costco, early COVID sheltering in place. We were already in Costco for groceries, and so I picked up some plants to play with for that week. And so on this succulent, I went ahead and misted it down, and I just wanted to really highlight those dewdrops with this very nice color and a bit of pattern in the background, but the eye is drawn directly to those dewdrops. And, you know, again, finding the very small pieces, the details of your already small, intimate scene is another way to really highlight your macro photography. And then, of course, we have our small life, our flying and buzzing and crawling friends that are out in our gardens and around. So, you know, if you have, it does take a lot more patience to work with a bee or a butterfly than it will a flower. The flower is not going to get up and fly away or run away quite as easily as, say, these insects. So But to me, I love the challenge and getting them, positioned just right, waiting for the bee to land on just the right flower, that it gives me the background that I want, or where the butterfly positions itself just right on the stick so that I can capture it in one plane, or the dragonfly that holds still so that I can stick my lens in its face to really get all that beautiful texture of the eye and the creaminess of the correct background so it's not blown out. This image was taken midday just a few days ago here in Las Vegas at one of the local parks that has a little bit of it's the Henderson Bird Viewing Preserve. So they have water ponds, and just trying to find that one who would hold still and let me get its image and was in open shade. It's a lot of patience when it comes to working with the flying and crawling macro subjects. But they really can be found pretty much anywhere you have plants, vegetation. You're going to find some sort of insect life, and they make for absolutely wonderful macro subjects because people know what size an ant is. People know the average size of a beetle, or a moth or a butterfly or a dragonfly. These are things that people can tell how, what they normally see it as. So when you're able to present an image like this, they know exactly how big or small, say, this flower that the ant is standing on. It gives a bit of perception to go with it, what for viewers besides just you and the ant in this situation. It does work on a bit larger if you, once again, with patience, and if you get a cooperative subject. I also like using my macro lens for things like lizards or snakes. Obviously, probably not rattlers or other poisonous snakes. I would not suggest it. Make sure you take that with a long lens. But for non-venomous animals, try using your macro lens to pick up the details, whether it's the eye, the scales, or even at home with your pets, picking up the details of their whiskers can be really fun exercises. So then setting the scene. And I mentioned this early on about natural versus curated. And so I wanted to touch on that because especially during these times where some of us may be staying home more frequently, or we don't have access to extensive gardens, or it's the evening, we're bored, we want to find something to play with, and we decide to work on our macro. I want to make sure that that you all understand kind of the differences in how you can set up a scene yourself. So with the natural, that's going to be what's found in nature. You don't have, you just come across it and it works. So that's where the patience comes in, especially with bugs, in finding them and making, getting them positioned just right, and waiting for them to, crawl into that position or fly onto that particular flower. Whereas the curated is more, okay, you're going to have something set up in your kitchen or dining room or living room, wherever it might be, and you're going to work with lights. Even if it's just window light, you're still being able to figure out when the best time is to work with that window. And you're able to, say, move those succulents from one side of the house to the other to make sure that you get the best light. But so the curated is going to be more of your studio. But I don't like saying studio because it doesn't have to be, set up with all the lights like you would walk in for a portrait studio. So curated, this particular image is, again, a box of succulents. It was that same from that last one that I bought at Costco. It was in the same box, and I set it up, and I had a flashlight on one side, and put the droplet there, and was able to shoot 10 o'clock at night when I was up, couldn't sleep, and wanted to play with macro and my new plants. So there's quite a bit of options when it comes to finding scenes or creating scenes to work with macro photography. Another natural one, I like going out in the mornings and walking around the neighborhood, especially if it's rained. Now that's more in California, but if it's been raining out or if there's been mist or dew. And so this image here, the natural one, this blade of grass with the droplet on it, that is not a curated image. That was just morning dew drops and the sun hitting it. And my neighbors think I'm crazy because I was laying down on the sidewalk. As I'm prone to do for these shots, I will lay flat down in order to get shots. And so perspective with natural settings is also a big consideration. So when you're working in your natural setting, not only is it patience, but you also have to be willing to either get up high or a lot of times get down low as possible in order to make a scene work and really bring out that detail that you are trying to highlight with it that you found in nature. Curated, once again, this is what I consider a studio setting. So for this particular one, I had gotten the dandelion seeds. I collected some off of my front lawn, and I had a studio. I don't have studio lights, but what I used is I have a rectangular camping flashlight, and so I just set that off to the side, and I'm able to control kind of the strength of that light by just moving it either further or closer to my subject. And I had an old piece of glass from an old frame, and I put it over some black cardboard and put a black sheet a sheet behind it, and was able to create this image. So again, finding those small bits of nature that are able to be brought inside and finding ways to photograph them that might be unique or interesting. That's another way to really get in and get your hands dirty, if you will, with macro in a controlled setting. And I really love kind of the bright and soft images, especially when it comes to macro photography. And it's just my particular preference. And so what I will do a lot of times to create this effect in a natural setting is I actually will shoot through surrounding objects. So for these, I'm shooting through, either with the purple one, I'm shooting through other flower blooms, or for this light purple flower with the green, I'm shooting through other vegetation. And so my subject's a bit further away, and then I have placed the vegetation literally in front of my lens. So I'll have a lens hood on, but it's going to be resting against that lens hood, and it just adds this depth and creaminess to the image. So that's a way you can, to me, it's still considered natural. I didn't move plants to where they are. I just used what was around, and again, looking for that perspective that will give me this particular setup and give me this effect. But if you're working with potted plants, there's nothing that says you don't set, a daffodil at one end of the deck, and then you have some tulips in front of your lens to give it a great color halo, if you will. If they're in potted plants, that's a great way to move things around and figure out new compositions and really play with what you have just in your backyard. When it comes to lighting, so we've kind of set the scene with, how you can find your different scenes, whether it's natural or curated. And then with curated, kind of the steps you might look for to bring inside or find to create a indoor studio type setting. But lighting is also very important, whether you're working in a natural setting or in a curated one. My favorite by far is open shade. It's going to give you great hues when it comes to the vibrancy of color, but you're not going to necessarily have to worry about highlights as much in open shade. So if you're careful with your placement and make sure you don't have any highlights from any dappledness, but if it's solid open shade, it works really, really well for macro photography because you're not having to worry about highlights and blowouts. So if you can't have open shade, the next best thing in my opinion, is going to be overcast or rainy days. And this is because basically the clouds do your work for you, and it acts as a diffuser for any light coming through. Also, it adds those dewdrops that give those additional details to your small scenes. And so you can see some of these. The one on the left is with the pine needles and the drops. That was taken on a rainy day. The flowers in the middle, that was on just an overcast day that had had rain earlier on. And so there was these leftover drops. They aren't quite as crisp as the other dewdrops because they had been sitting for a little while. And also you'll find various plants will hold the droplets differently. So some plants are better for round dewdrops, some are better for just the domed droplets, and others the water doesn't quite like to stick in any particular form, and so it'll kind of spread like it does on this flower here. So that's something you can play with, especially when you're doing your curated scenes, is seeing which flowers will hold water the way you want it to. However, we all know that we can't necessarily order weather to be what we want it to be. And so sometimes we just have to work with what we're given. Open shade with macro is a lot easier to create. So a lot of times carrying a hat or an umbrella or some sort of shade with you. You can even use sometimes your camera backpack to kind of lean and give your subject shade if you need to. But especially when working with moving subjects, that's not necessarily always an option. So shooting a bright light, you can absolutely do it. Again, being aware of white backgrounds or white highlights. And also when working with very vibrant flowers, such as these yellow flowers or red, you want to make sure that your highlights on those color ranges, on those gamuts, are also not being blown out. So if on your digital SLRs, a lot of times it'll give you the option to see the 3 different color channel histograms. And so a lot of times on bright days, if I'm shooting macro like this with brightly colored flowers, I'll pull that up to make sure I'm not clipping on those particular histograms. And that will help me make sure that I'm not losing detail on yellows or reds or greens, any of those channels, or blues. So something to be aware of with bright sun, but that's not to say that you can't shoot macro in bright sunlight. It's something that you can shoot regardless of weather, regardless of the time of day. It really is kind of one of those, there is no bad timing, bad light. It's just a matter of finding the right subject. And then, of course, in curated situations, you have controlled or directed light. So in this situation with the stem here on the left, I was using just window light, but I was able to direct, because it was a potted plant, I was able to turn the pot to get the light exactly where I wanted it on the plant in order to take this image. With the droplet here in the middle, again, that was using both a bit of window light and my flashlight that I've talked about. So that was a controlled lighting situation. And again, with the oil and water, using my light from below the bowl, giving that rim light, those highlights around the bubbles, but not putting the light on the background itself, was a controlled decision that I made. And so it works really well if you do have lighting for indoors, if you're going to be working with macro inside and in a controlled setting. The other great thing about controlled settings is you can sometimes set them up so that you can have reflected images in those droplets. I really, to me, this is a very challenging thing for me to do. And so the flower reflected there, just that one kind of happened. I was looking for it, but I didn't have to move or adjust anything. But they are potted plants. They are in the window. So it is a curated session, if you will, when I was shooting those. But I did find that one. And then this other one, the green one, that's just, it's a reflection of my kitchen, actually, in that dewdrop, because again, I was shooting in my kitchen with the succulents, and I just happened, that one was again happenstance. I did not set it up that there should be a pot in the reflection, but it does go to show example of how you can use droplets to pick up on other parts of a scene that would otherwise be hidden from a viewer, and really draw attention to that very small world within a world, if you will. And then also when you are looking at a scene, you've got the lighting set up and you're ready to shoot, do what you can to clean, what I call clean up the session, or the setting, if you will. So in this, we have on the left, you have all the little air bubbles that are trapped within the water in this water and oil image. And on the right, you have, after 30 plus minutes of me going in and doing cloning and spot removal for it, you know, it's a lot of time in front of the computer that I would rather be out shooting if I had just taken the time to let the scene set a bit longer, and all those air bubbles would have come to the surface and I would have been able to take a clean shot. But I was having fun shooting, and so I ended up paying the price on the back end and having to just clone out all of those little dots to clean up the scene. But it also, if you're out in nature, you can always carry with you like a small paintbrush. And so if you're photographing a flower and it's got a bit of dirt on its petal, just, you know, brushing it off with a gentle, you know, paintbrush. There's nothing wrong with that, and just cleaning up that scene so you don't necessarily have to make the changes in your post-processing. All right, so at this point, we've gone through, pardon me, we've gone through what you should look for in a scene, setting up your scene both naturally and curated. But I've touched a bit on gear in saying, you know, oh, I use a flashlight or this or that, but I really want to touch on what gear you might have if you're going to look at getting into macro more seriously, especially during these times where it can be very helpful as a creative, just as having an outlet in photography that you can get a wide range of views from. So I use a dedicated macro lens, the Tamron 90mm 2.8, and I absolutely love it. I've also used a Nikon 105 dedicated macro lens. So for those of you who are really going to get into it, but you know, who are really interested in this, but don't necessarily have a dedicated lens, I would highly suggest getting a dedicated lens. To me, it just really makes you think in that macro level and not get distracted. So it really helps, at least for me. When I put that macro lens on, I know I'm not going to go out for wildlife. I'm not necessarily going to go out for landscape. I'm going out for macro. And I'm going to be working with that. And it really helps me delve into my macro scenes a lot more, rather than getting distracted by the possibilities elsewhere of other genres of photography. So, however, that being said, I do use a lot of telephoto lenses for what's considered close-ups. They aren't traditional macro images because they aren't taken with a actual macro lens, but they are close-ups. So I use the Tamron 18-400, and I will use that a lot for flower photography, macro photography, close-up photography when I'm out in the field and I've just been scouting and I only carry one lens with me during some of those hikes. Other times I've taken B photos with my 150-600 at the 600 range. So you can get close-up pseudo macro images even without a dedicated macro lens. So if you're just wanting to kind of try your hand at it, I would suggest using your telephoto lenses. You're just not necessarily going to get as good of bokeh, and your depths of field are going to be a bit wider than you would necessarily have with a dedicated macro lens. So if you're shooting with just a cell phone, you do have the option of clip-on lenses, or the possibility of using a loop or other magnifying accessory. So if we do have anybody who's, you know, an iPhone shooter, or other, you know, tablet shooter, there are still options for you as well. For stabilization, I do most of my work handheld, kind of across the board, but a tripod or using something like a platypod, because a platypod gets you really down low but still stabilizes you, so you can get down in the grass and very close to your subject while still having the stabilization, and it's not very large, so you don't have to carry around a big tripod if you're just needing to use it for some of the stabilization. However, a traditional tripod is great when working like flower fields and other, you know, if you have a bush and things like that. So carrying something for stabilization is great, especially if you're going for a curated look where you have time to set up the entire scene. It will give you more options when it comes to your settings. And then supplemental lighting. You can go all out and get professional studio lighting, or, you know, nothing. Most of my work is shot with natural light. Those few things I do indoors, then I use a Goal Zero flashlight, which is, it's a bar flashlight for camping. And that's what I just use because that's what I already have around the house. So, but yeah, so for gear, that's traditionally my setup. I have the Tamron 90, my tripod or platypod, and the one light, and I go. So now talking about settings. Again, how I shoot macro is very airy. I like to have very small pieces of the image that are in focus, and then the rest of it kind of fades out into this creaminess. That's my style. So do take that into consideration. What your preference is when it comes to styling, and the settings that are needed for that particular style that you like. For me, when it comes to macro, it's the top priority is depth of field. So here we have f5.3, and it was focusing just on the tips of those flowers and see the very front tip, so you can see how just absolutely smooth and creamy and how quickly that depth of field tapers off, just into this very smooth look. Whereas with an f11, I was able to get pretty much this whole bunch of plum blossoms in focus, and then it starts tapering about midway through the bunch where the stem is. And so you can see you're not dealing with a whole lot of depth of field as it is. Even at f11, that's only maybe an inch of depth. So, and with a dedicated macro lens, this is the type of depth of field that you're working with, the small slivers as you work through your aperture range. I use all manual. However, aperture priority, if you are not at the full manual level, I would highly suggest using aperture priority when working with macro. And that way you're able to choose your aperture and the camera will do the rest of the work for you on which other settings. Plus, it's a good way to work yourself up to going full manual. I also will use a single point of focus, again, because I like the softness. I like having very shallow depths of field where just a hint of the image, of the detail, of the subject is in focus. So for me, this up here on this top left corner, you can see where I had my focus there. My focus was right here on these little yellow and white flowers right in the middle there. And then everything from there falls off, or directly on the dewdrop. So the dewdrop, as well as the reflection of other leaves that are outside of the frame, are sharp, and the depth of field falls off from there, or directly on the edge of the petal. And then using a low ISO if possible. So I typically have a higher ISO than what a lot of people will use for macro. I'm 600, 800. 800 is my average setting. For macro, I won't normally go much above that, but I can easily shoot 800 ISO all day because I handhold. However, if you're on a tripod, if you're working in a curated setting without a whole lot of movement, you can be working with an ISO of 100 easily, and that will help keep any noise out of your images as well. When it comes to shutter speed, for me, once again, the depth of field is very important. However, because I shoot very wide open, a lot of times my shutter speed, I don't have to worry about too much. But the a lower shutter speed in a controlled environment, so like with those dandelion seeds that I had in it was my office, I had it completely controlled environmentally. Everything from lighting to there was no air movement, nothing like that. So I was able to set up and work with a very low ISO and work with a longer shutter speed because nothing was moving in that scene. However, when you're working with insects such as this ant here, you want to have a higher shutter speed because the ant is moving. You're most likely hand holding, but I was working in the shade here. So not only was my ISO higher, but then my shutter speed needed to be higher as well. And so in order to freeze the movement of that ant, so the ant would not be blurred. If you're working outside and it's breezy out and your subject is sometimes moving, you also want to be using a higher shutter speed. And so if it is probably, for me, the worst situation would be a bright sunny day trying to shoot midday with a breeze where I need a higher shutter speed, but it's still so bright out I can't get it a low enough ISO to make it work. Those are relatively rare conditions. A lot of times then I just kind of pop a hat and give it some open shade, but that is something to look out for because especially with us being in the summer months now, quite a few of us have a lot of sunny days, and that is one consideration taken to when you go out to shoot and working with the shutter speed. And I did mention the creative photography and how you can work with these images creatively. And by playing with your shutter speed, you can then play with the creative aspects. So using a very shallow depth of field along with a lower shutter speed in open shade and moving the camera, doing intentional camera movement with a slower shutter speed, can give you these very soft, abstract, impressionistic images. And I absolutely love working with that, not just in macro, but in general. I have a whole gallery on my website with that as well, and teach courses on that. But so for me, the creative also, creative abstract images also work really well. So if you do have an overcast day and you've got flowers and you've got wind, I would set up a tripod and do a longer, slower shutter speed and see what happens, and take a whole bunch of them and see if any of the patterns of the wind moving those flowers like brush strokes might work for you. So again, not only trying to capture these details in very creative but realistic ways, but then also looking at them from more of a creative perspective will give you a really wide range of things to study with macro. And then, so once you've gotten your photos, we've gone out, we've found our setting, we've looked at the lighting, we've looked at how we're going to, you know, what perspective we're going to get, and if we're going to control the setting or not, and what shutter speed and what gear that we're going to have at our disposal. Once you have those images, then going in and developing them, I think is a very important part of the process. But that being said, I do like to keep it very simple. And so keeping it simple for me, where I shoot in RAW so that it's less destructive on the editing, and I can make the most choices possible. Shooting in RAW collects all the information from that scene without leaving anything else. If you shoot just in JPEG, you're allowing the camera's algorithms to decide what data is kept and what data is not. And there's minimal processing going on just to create the JPEG file. So I shoot in RAW, and then using Lightroom and only Lightroom, I do very minimal processing to focus on the subject. So that may be increasing the exposure if I've had to shoot a little bit underexposed to get the required shutter speed, or have a slightly slower lens, or if I use a deeper depth of field. So if I'm shooting at that f11, then I may underexpose just slightly. So I want to correct that. And then using a radial filter, putting a radial filter. So in this situation with this particular image, I might put the radial filter right around this middle flower, and then just slightly and carefully use the clarity slider to de-clarify everything around that flower, just to really give that softness that I look for in my work. But if I spend more than 5 minutes on an image, I'm spending too much time. I don't, for me, I don't do image stacking. I don't do focus stacking. So for me, this is as complicated as processing gets. Basic adjustments to contrast, to I rarely touch even the saturation. It's just going to be contrast and a bit of maybe radial filters for clarity, and maybe a bit of vignetting. But very, very simple. And that's how I end up processing my images very quickly in batches, which is why I could be out shooting every day during COVID, and processing and really kind of being creative and being able to stay creative and use as much time in the field as I can without having to sit in front of the computer. So that's my take on macro photography and finding the small things in life to focus on. So
that was wonderful. Can I throw some questions at you?
absolutely, please, any questions?
Okay, so let me go back real quick. Do you mind taking down your
Yeah, absolutely.
screen? Let's see. Let me get to my screen here. Okay, so I think you answered this, but I want to make sure because I might have blinked. Susan Upton wanted to make sure that she understood guidance on aperture values to get that sharp and in focus result. Is there a magic number for you? Or is that
So
just?
no, I normally will shoot pretty wide open. It depends on my subject. So with flowers, it can range because it's going to be what property of that flower am I looking for? Is it the pattern? Is it the color? Is it that I want the whole bunch of flowers, like with the plum blossoms? Do I want all of those in focus, or do I just want the stamen in focus? And so the big thing with that is going to be getting your focus point, which is why I use single point focus, getting your focus point just right on that, on what you are trying to focus on, and then taking the image. Because even if you're you're working with very shallow depths of field, so if it's off even slightest, the whole image is going to be off and you're going to miss your focus. So the aperture and the focus they correspond, but they are different. So with the focus, you want your autofocus on, or even if you're doing manual focus, you want to make sure your focus point is exactly where you want it, and it's very, very precise when it comes to macro. And then your aperture, depending on how you want your image to turn out, using a wide open aperture, or so a smaller number, your 2.8, 5.6, will give you that sharpness where you focused, but then a creaminess in the background. Or you can go for a deeper depth of field, that f11, f16, and get more of the scene and the surrounding area from that focus point in focus.
Okay. So Debbie is asking, do you use any extension tubes or close-up filters?
I do not use any of those. I have, between the dedicated macro lenses and the telephoto lenses, those are the two that I use to capture my images.
And Vin wants to know, do you focus stack, or is focus stacking done in any of the images that we saw tonight?
No, no. All the images that you saw tonight are all single images. No focus stacking, no merging, no HDR. They're all single frame images.
Okay. Let's see here. David Valdez this is the statement. He's like, getting my batteries charged so I can go shooting tomorrow. So I think you've spurred some inspiration. So that's what I like to hear.
Good,
so,
absolutely.
His question, he's got two. How many shots per image do you shoot?
Ooh, that's a hard one because it really depends. So obviously, if I'm working with insects, I'll shoot a lot more than if I'm working with flowers. I will try and get it right within 1 to 2 frames. If the wind's blowing, I might shoot a few more because, again, I shoot very shallow depths of field. So if that flower moves even the smallest bit, it can throw the whole image. So I'll shoot several of them. But I also check the back on my screen, on my camera. I check that frequently. Macro, unless you're dealing with an insect or lizard, your plants aren't going anywhere. So you can normally take your time a bit more unless you have wildly shifting skies and your lighting's fluctuating.
So this is a great question from David Wilson. It's a selfish one for me too. Do you have to perform autofocus fine tuning on a macro lens, or do you?
I have not had to.
Okay.
I have not had to at all.
And I'm sorry, I think you said it, but do you manually focus all your shots?
I use autofocus on most of my shots.
Okay.
When I'm doing more of the creative work, that's when I'll do manual focusing, because a lot of times I'll use defocusing, or I'll want something that the camera's not quite wanting to pick up on sometimes. But there are, if you're working in very low contrast situations, you may end up going to manual focus just to make sure that your focus is on the exact spot that you want if your autofocus is having issues.
Okay, so this is a Tamron question. So Robert wants to know, as a third-party manufacturer for Tamron, are there some advantages using a Tamron lens versus, you know, others? And
price is a really big one.
Price is a huge one. I know. That was the first thing that came to my mind. So he wants to know, do you know if they make mounts for Sony yet?
They do. Actually, they've been putting out quite a lot of Sony. They have basically an entire line now specifically for Sony at this point, and they're getting rave reviews. I don't shoot Sony, I shoot Nikon, but I have plenty of other friends and you know, ambassadors who shoot with the Sony line, and they cannot say enough about it for the Sony E-mount, for the mirrorless. So, but for me, using third party, not only is there the cost incentive, but for me, I have yet to see where I am missing any quality that I might get elsewhere. Like, my lenses are sharp, they are amazing, they're fast, they're lightweight, so I can carry them, you know, wherever I might be in the world without ease. And on top of that, Tamron's customer service is just head over heels. Like, I couldn't ask for a better set of guys and gals at customer service. You know, they are really on the ball when it comes to answering questions. You can reach out to their techs, most of their ambassadors like myself, you can reach out to us. But so if you have questions, if you have issues, please let us know, and we'll try and get them solved as best we can.
I'm going to back you up on that, because I have had to reach out to different Tamron reps, and they either they know the answer or they can fix it. Like I can hand my camera over to them and they just tinker with something, and I'm like, it was simply me hitting a button wrong. But you know, I've had problems with one lens and it was immediately taken care of. It was great. So
so don't let third party like put you off. It just the funny thing is, a lot of Tamron glass goes into non-Tamron lenses to be sold under different names.
Right. So
why not get the Tamron glass from Tamron? That's all I'm going to say.
Okay. I am following you. Okay, so this is a question that I'm sure a lot of people want to know, but Peter's going to be brave and just ask, how does one become a Tamron ambassador?
Ooh.
How did that happen?
I wish I could tell you. I personally, I'm under the impression I just bugged them enough. But but no. So basically, it came down to I talked with, you know, I was in Vegas. I met with their reps. I bought lenses from them. I held classes for the local camera store here. The camera store here plugged me. BNC Photo Camera here in Vegas, absolutely amazing shop if you're ever in need, and up here in the Vegas area. Yeah, you know, and I just started, every time I posted an image, I post it with hashtag with my Tamron and then the lens that I took it with. And then they reached out and asked if I had a series of images, and ended up getting published in their magazine, and that caught the attention of the higher ups. And so it just kind of snowballed. It's little steps, just kind of drawing their eye to me best I could. But it really, for me, it really was kind of just out of left field. One day being contacted and saying, hey, and I said, sure.
That's
so
awesome.
There's no tried and true method. It's whatever works.
Yeah. So I think you mentioned you used a Nikon lens. Does that mean that what body are you using? And
so I use the Nikon D500, which is a crop sensor, but they're top of the line crop sensor. They're a pro body. And before I got the Tamron, I have a very old, like will work on film cameras, um, Nikon 105 macro. And it's slow and it's clunky and it's loud, but it still works to take beautiful images, but it's not what I actually want to have in the field with me. So
So,
the Tamron 90 is what I use.
so are most of your shots single shot, or are you shooting in burst mode?
I will do mostly single shot
Okay.
because I'll take a shot, look and see if I need to adjust the focal point or maybe my perspective. Maybe I'm not quite getting it right. Again, I work very slow when it comes to this. I'll take an hour with a flower easily. So
And you guys, she's just referenced an article that drew me to her. On her website, she does, it was a blog or a write-up, but it was called An Hour with a Flower. And the premise behind it was slow it down, take your time, spend time with one flower, which is very difficult and challenging for me because I think I've got a little OCD or something. But I actually did that because I'm stuck at home and I'm in a prison. I'm like in a prison. I told you about this. And that's something I don't do. But I will tell you that I have a series of the sunflower, and I've gotten a lot of compliments on it, and I'm thinking, it's a sunflower. It was a weed. It was actually something I didn't plant. And it's brought me such delight. And it needs to be yanked out because it's definitely dead and stringy and awful, but I just can't do it because I have some type of weird connection to it. And I'm going to blame that on you.
That's fine. I'll take that blame. I'll take that blame.
Go look at that article because a lot of us are still, well, I think all of us are still stuck at home. And maybe it doesn't have to be an hour with a flower. Maybe it's another subject, but spend that time and take a look at her website because her impressionistic images are some of my favorites. And I'm going to twist your arm and maybe talk you into coming back and maybe doing a presentation on that a little bit later. Yeah, so this is wonderful, Bender. I'm telling you, this was great. And, we just kind of ran into each other kind of like at an out of Chicago conference that was a virtual conference. And then it became, I went to her website, found that article, and then we had a conversation on Monday that went on probably longer than she wanted it to, but
it was super fun.
Yeah, it was super fun. And so here you are, and this group is so appreciative, and I hope that if you guys are taking some macro shots as a result of this session with Bender, tag us both, and let us see what you guys are doing. And she's got email, so use it. Keep in contact. This is a great opportunity to meet new people and connect. And I hope that she inspired you to get out and play a little bit. So with that, any closing remarks that you want to add?
I did just put my Instagram and website in the chat, but it's going to be at abenderphoto on Instagram or abenderphotography.com for my website. I do a monthly article and do a monthly newsletter, so feel free to sign up for that. Please reach out if you have any questions, any comments. Feel free to tag me in any macro pictures that this might have inspired. Yeah, I just love to hear from you.
That's great. All right, with that, I'm going to say thank you. Thanks for coming on. And
thank you so much.
I'm going to pin you down with another date pretty soon.
Sounds great.
All right, guys, next week, our guest is John Fisher, who's going to present Unlocking the Power of Photoshop. John lives and breathes Photoshop, so he's promised to introduce us to the cornerstones of what makes Photoshop such a powerful tool that helps us create amazing images. Thank you for joining us tonight. Until next Wednesday, go out and create something beautiful, and I hope that we will see you again next week.